Okay, we're on to my favourite topic once again, and it's cost to serve. Now, if you're wondering where we are today, I'm actually bouncing around in the back of a taxi in Bangkok. But a lot of people have been commenting on the cost to serve videos here on the channel and asking for more information on how do you actually do the analysis. So that's what we're going to be looking through this week, coming right up. I can't actually step you through the case study, that's confidential, but what I'm going to do is to kind of go through a sanitized version of it. And it's going to give you a really good idea of how to go through the cost to serve analysis. Now what we'll do is I'm going to put up a few lists and things on the screen as well. So as you're going through this, when a list appears, you might want to just sort of pause the video and make notes as we're going through. Okay, so what we're looking at here is cost to serve analysis of a warehouse. And this will give you a very good idea of how to do the analysis, and you'll be able to apply this approach to really any function in supply chain. If you're doing transport or inventory or customer service, the same approach will apply. Okay, so the warehouse that we're talking about, it's actually in the pharmaceutical industry, not that it sort of matters a great deal. And I'm going to draw it up here. Let me do it with a big pen to begin with. And what we decided to do for this particular client was to look at all of the processes in the warehouse going from receipt through to dispatch. Now, as we discussed at the Academy, you can really use whatever scope you like when you're doing cost to serve analysis. So, for example, we could include the customer service function. We could obviously include the transport going out to customers. We could involve procurement. In this particular case, we're just looking at what happens inside the four walls of the warehouse. So the key activities that we're really looking at, and I'm just going to refer to the case study here, and we'll put these up on the screen. So first of all, we've got the receipt function, and I'm going to kind of do this as a sort of block diagram to make sense. So we've got the receipting of the product coming in. We've then got the put away of the product. That's obviously getting put away into storage. We've then got the storage of the product, and I'll just represent that by a box. But actually there was different types of storage, and there was what was referred to as a high bay storage. So if you can imagine narrow aisle forklifts or stacker cranes, that type of thing, automated cranes going about 10 meters high. And then there was normal sort of adjustable pallet racking type storage. And then I think there was storage in bins and shelving, that type of thing. And then there was probably some carton live storage as well. So, we need to take account of the different types of storage being used in the warehouse. So we've got the put away. We've then got some replenishment going on. So this is not meant to represent an actual warehouse layout, because you wouldn't do it this way, but let's say we've got some bulk storage, and so there's some replenishment going on into each of these areas. And then what other functions have we got happening? We've obviously got picking taking place in each of these areas, and the product's coming out then to a packing function, and then it's getting assembled ready for dispatch. And I think that's all of the functions that we talked about in that particular warehouse. Okay, so that's the scope. What sort of costs then are we going to include? And again, we'll put this up on a list here. Let me just run through them. And again, any function that you're talking about for a cost to serve analysis, you need to think of all of the costs involved in it. So here, what sort of cost would you expect to have to include in the warehouse? So we've got the facility cost itself, the box if you like. We've got all the light and power and so on associated with running that. We've obviously got the labour, all the people working in there. We've got the supervisors and managers. We've got the MHE that's running around moving pallets and so on. We have got the actual storage media, so we've got high bay racking, we've got normal racking, we've got bins, we've got the carton load storage. We've got equipment in the office, so we've got an office over here. We need to include that because that's all the cost of running the warehouse. We've got the packaging here. We've got the IT systems running it. So we've probably got a WMS system. We need to look at the licenses and the maintenance and so on associated with that. We've got a degree of administration. And we've actually got an inventory holding cost as well. Because obviously if we've got 10-week stock or 20-week stock, we've actually got the monetary investment in that stock, and there's a cost of capital associated with holding that stock. So there's quite a few different costs that we can look at, particularly for warehousing. Okay, now the tricky bit. We need to start allocating those costs to the different functions. And again, this is a warehouse example, but you can use the same principle if you're looking at transport or inventory or customer service. So let's think for a moment about how we're going to allocate the cost of the physical storage. And would you do that on a square metre basis? Well, you might think of that to begin with, but we've got some high bay storage, which might go up to 10 metres. We've got some binning, which is maybe only using 2 metres of space. So I would suggest when you're looking at allocating storage costs that you do it on a cubic metre, because obviously this is far more efficient. We're fitting a lot more product into this storage cube than we are here. We've got fresh air above the bins and the carton load storage. So that's certainly one way to allocate the storage costs. And I would do that in terms of all of the costs associated with the building and the space. I would allocate in terms of a cubic metre. So we might do, systems, maintenance of the building rent, all of that sort of cost. Then when we start to come down to the functions, let's think about the receipting. What's a logical way of actually allocating the costs? First of all, what are the costs that we're going to have to allocate to receipting? There's the physical space, so we might do that on a cubic metre basis, because even though we're not receipting the full height of the building, we're using it, we're occupying it. What other costs have we got? We've got the labour in there, and then you've got to think about how that product actually presents itself at receipt. We've got pallets of product coming in. Is it just one product on a pallet? Is it multiple SKUs? Do we have to open cartons to check the contents and so on? So just think about that for a moment and think about how you might allocate those costs. And I will tell you exactly how we've done it on this one. And we have done that actually based on a cubic metre of product. You might, depending on your operation, want to do it on maybe the number of lines being processed. That could actually make a lot more sense for some businesses. Or you might want to do it based on the number of SKUs or whatever. But there's no hard and fast rule with doing this. So you need to, that's what I meant about understanding conceptually how you're going to do this is really the important bit, because once you've decided how you're going to do the analysis is pretty simple. So here it was done on a cubic metre basis. So a pallet of product is probably 1.5 cubic metres. And then we would allocate all of the costs to individual receipted orders based on that cost. We've then got the replenishment activity happening there. We might just be allocating costs there for the MHE used and the people used. Obviously in the receipting as well, we've got people. So if you think about the replenishment and the put away, what resources are we using there? We're using materials handling equipment, we're using people, we're using systems. So we want to allocate a proportion of all of those costs to that function. And where we can clearly identify which functions people work in, obviously that's easy. So there was some put away and some replenishment staff here, so that was fairly easy to do. The storage we talked about briefly. I would generally allocate costs there based on the cubic metres used. So for example, let's say we've got 10,000 cubic meters of product in here, we're going to allocate all of those costs per cubic meter of product being handled. So we've got, the building costs, the cube represented by storage will take a large proportion of the warehouse fixed costs. We've got all of the admin, the WMS, a proportion of that, and we're going to allocate all of that cost. Let's say we've got 10,000 cubic meters of product. We're going to divide it by 10,000 meters, and we will then have a cost per cubic meter for the storage function. Now, obviously, if we have a small carton going through the carton live storage, I don't know why I put CTS there. It's actually CLS, isn't it? Carton live storage. I've got cost to serve on the brain. If we've got cartons going through there, they're going to pick up a much smaller proportion of that storage cost. If we've got huge cartons being stored in the adjustable pallet racking or the high bay, they're going to pick up a bigger proportion of the storage cost. And that's the whole principle. We've got to make sure that different activities and products are picking up a fair allocation of the cost. Smaller products pick up a smaller proportion of the storage cost. We've then got the picking activity taking place. And again, we should be able to allocate or determine how many of the warehouse staff are actually actively involved in picking. So it's mainly going to be a labour cost, but there may be some MHE involved. There could be order pickers, forklift trucks, all sorts of things. So we need to lump all of those costs together. And then we need to think of what's a logical way to allocate that bucket of costs. So we've got some picking activity going. You could look at that in terms of orders picked. You could look at it in terms of lines picked. You could look at it in terms of actual picks. In this particular case, we looked at the cost per hit. So I need to explain some picking terminology here. So if I'm going to a location here to pick a product, I could allocate the cost based on the fact that I'm filling an order. So I've got to wander around the warehouse and pick a load of products to fill the order. Or I could allocate the costs based on the fact that I went to this location to pick some products. But a better way to do it, much more accurately, is to work out how many products I actually picked when I got there, and that's called a hit. So I'm going to a pick location, I'm going to pick some products, and I'm going to hit that location 5 times. So in other words, I'm picking 5 SKUs. So in this case, that's what we decided to do with this particular operation. It was fairly sort of high density picking lots of SKUs, and that was a logical way to do it. In your own operation, when you're looking at this, you need to think, well, are we picking pallets? Are we picking cartons? Are we picking eaches? And you need to determine what's the most logical method then of allocating costs for your picking, because obviously every operation is a little bit different. So then we've got the picked product coming out into the packing area. What sort of costs would we allocate for the packing function? We're using space. So we've got to allocate some of the warehouse space. Again, I would do it on a cubic basis, because even though it's happening at floor level, we're using normally the whole height of the building, the whole cube of the building. So we should work out, if this is being done in, this particular footprint on the floor, we've got to include the whole cube right up to the roof as well. Unless, of course, you've got a mezzanine with something else happening. So that's the actual warehouse building costs that we've got to include. We've got labour to include, the people doing the packing. We've got packing materials to include. And again, we build up a bucket of costs for all the costs associated with that particular function. And then we've got to work out, how much of that cost do we allocate? What's the allocation method? So again, would you do it by order? No, I wouldn't, because the orders are all going to be different sizes. And you're going to have an unfair cost allocation. Would you do it by line? Well, what if you've got 100 cartons of one line and 1 carton of another? They're not going to pick up a fair allocation of costs, are they? You might do it by SKU, perhaps. I would actually probably do it, if you think this through, I'd probably do this one by cubic meter of product. So in other words, again, a bit like the picking, the small carton's going to pick up a smaller proportion of the the packing and dispatch function because we're not using so many packing materials. The handling is easier. We're using less space. So I think on a cubic meter basis would probably work quite well with that. And then if we want to break down the dispatch function itself, this particular operation was using tote bins, so the packing was pretty simple and the costs were allocated just on the basis of a cost per tote. But again, we would have to understand what proportion of the warehouse space is used, what's the labour being used, giving a little bit of systems cost towards that, a bit of admin cost, and so on. So look, that's a pretty simple walkthrough of a case study where we're looking at cost to serve analysis of warehousing. But as I mentioned, you would use that same principle in any function, whether it be transport, inventory management, or customer service. It's really a case of starting off by collecting all of the costs, all of the fixed and variable costs associated with the operation, identifying then the key functions that are taking place, working out the cost allocation method. So we've talked about the warehouse. We're grouping all of the costs associated with the building, and we're going to allocate those on a cubic meter basis. How many cubic meters of that warehouse is being used by that function? And then further, within each function, we're allocating those costs, sometimes based on the cubic meter of product being handled, or maybe by the number of items being picked, or the cubic meter of product being packed and dispatched. So it's always going to be a little bit different, and the tricky bit is getting your head around it conceptually to begin with, to understand what's the logical way of allocating these costs. So what was the outcome of this one? I've talked about this case study a few times. What we were actually able to do then, going through a very, very detailed analysis, we had probably 1 million orders being dispatched through this facility. All of the costs, and I should mention, all of the costs were allocated to each order historically. So we've talked about how to allocate the costs. I suppose then the actual detailed way of doing the analysis, if you picture for a moment, you've got a spreadsheet with 100,000 order lines on it. You've got order number, you've got SKU number, you've got quantities. If you then link that with a product master file, so then you have all of the cubes and weights and so on associated with the products, you can drag that in. And then the idea is that you can use that transaction file, and all I do is I literally put a column for each of these functions. So if I'm doing picking, for example, I've got an order line. We've got an order line here of, X, Y, Z, and it will tell me that I've got an order, X, Y, Z. I've got 3 order lines. It's telling me what the SKU is. I'm pulling in the dimensions, so I know the cubic meters of it. I know the kilograms if I'm using that as an allocation method. And all I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a column for each of these functions. So I've got receipt, I've got put away, I've got storage, I've got picking. And based on the method that I'm going to use for allocating the costs, I'm actually just going to drag in the costs on each of these order lines. And then we're going to have a total at the end. And that's as simple as it is. So, like I was saying, the hard bit is conceptually working out how you're going to allocate the costs. The analysis is easy. You're going to take a whole transaction history and you're going to just use your allocation calculation, if you like, to pull in the costs for each function against each order line. And then you're able to actually look at the costs of handling products through this warehouse in terms of orders, lines, SKUs, eaches, cartons. You can get some fantastic analysis out of it. So what was the result of this particular exercise? So I think we had something like 1 million orders on the spreadsheet. All of the costs were brought in for each of the functions. And what we were able to work out was that once you allocated these costs fairly to all of those transactions, about 30% of the orders going through this warehouse actually left with negative margin. So when I'm doing cost to serve analysis in here, I'll very often have a column. Let me just wipe out some of these, as we're running out of space. I'll very often have a column here which is, sales value and gross margin. Because ultimately what you're trying to look at is the profitability of each of these orders. So if we know what the gross margin is, and we know what all of the functional costs were associated with processing this order, and we can deduct that from the gross margin, we know how profitable the orders are. And we can even put in customer data here, and we can, if you're good on pivot tables, you can go nuts on this, or in databases. If we pull in the customer for each of these orders, we can actually spin that whole analysis around and start looking at it from a customer perspective, or a SKU perspective, or a product group perspective. You really can go mad with this stuff. But what we determined was that of all of the orders going through this warehouse, 30% of them coming out for dispatch had no gross margin left. So what that means is that it wasn't zero. That some were zero, and obviously a whole bunch were negative. So they're losing money on 30% of the orders going out, and that absolutely astounded the business. They just had no idea, and we're talking millions of dollars here. So obviously what they're able to do then is to look at the costs associated with processing these orders through the warehouse, and it stood out like the proverbial, to be honest. It was small orders that were doing it, 1 and 2 line orders, and so they worked out promotional schemes, incentive schemes with their customers just to try and creep up the size of the order instead of each's, getting them to buy boxes of 3 or 4, and that suddenly dropped to about 5%. You're always going to have orders that are not profitable. Look, in 95% of businesses you will. It's very, very hard not to have small orders, but you've got to try and minimize them. And the aim should always, obviously, be to have orders going out where you still have gross margin intact. The really scary part of this, of course, is that not only were 30% of the orders at negative margin, but that was only deducting the warehouse costs. If you then took those 30% or took that transaction history and then applied the transport cost for delivery to customers, if you applied the customer service function, if you applied the purchasing function, if you applied the actual head office overheads, that's probably going to be 50%. So this stuff can get a little bit scary, but it's well worth doing. And by going through this sort of process in whatever function you're looking at, you will find areas where money is just draining out of the business, and generally it's not too hard to fix. And the fix is normally try to look at ways to get the order size a little bit bigger. So you imagine orders going through here with 1 little carton. If we can suddenly get those orders going through with 2 little cartons and with the same cost base, we're getting a much, much lower cost per order going through. Okay, so that's a bit of a long ramble there, but to give you an idea of, in a detailed sense, how you actually go through the cost to serve analysis. Like I say, the tricky bit is conceptually understanding what you're trying to achieve, what all the various costs are, how we're going to bundle these costs together, working out a sensible way of allocating the costs for each of the functions. Once you've done that, it's just a question of getting a whole transaction file. I normally work on 12 months if I can. If that's too much data, you might do a monthly sample or something. And then you're just pulling in the costs for each of the functions, actually on each transactional line. And then you can go to your heart's content and analyze that and find out which are the products which are losing money, which are the customers that are losing money. And you can actually have a field day and improve your supply chain. Okay, so hopefully that example, going through in a bit of detail, look how you do the cost to serve analysis in a warehouse, is going to help you understand it a lot better. And you would just apply the same principle if you were looking at cost to serve in transport or any other function of the supply chain. So you know how it works on the channel. If you found this useful, do like, do comment, do subscribe, and we'll see you next week. Because don't forget, all our new videos come out on a Wednesday. See you then.